40 years of Tetris. Oh wait, we already did this spiel in the last video. Okay, never mind. Let's skip it then. Tetris Forever, a pretty recent release in 2024 from Digital Eclipse, and the third entry in their Gold Master series of game compilations that double as interactive timelines and documentaries covering the history of the subjects being covered. The Gold Master series includes the making of Karateka and the Jeff Vintner story. But really, the origins of this series could be traced back to Atari 50. An excellent look back at the history of the old Atari that recently got a couple DLC updates to include further historical information, including Atari's rivalry with Intellivision. A rivalry that concluded recently with the former's acquisition of the latter, and of course, coincidentally, Digital Eclipse, who has been around for a long time. They've made a bunch of compilations and other things that you may have been familiar with. Also happen to have been acquired by Atari, who graciously lets them do whatever they want, which is why we have stuff like this. But back to Tetris Forever. So Tetris Forever, much like Atari 50, Making of Karateka, Llama Winter Guy, and whatever else, it's part game compilation and part interactive timeline. I'm not going to go too deep into the interactive timeline part. They have a bunch of text blurbs, archival photos, and print scans of various pieces of Tetris lore organized in chronological order from 1984 to today. Not a whole lot in the today portion, or anything else for that matter. But, you know, you have some video interviews with some of the key individuals involved in the history of Tetris. A rather incomplete history of Tetris, I should say. They make no mention of car chases or anything like that. Almost as if that movie they made is a complete and utter lie. But regardless, the story of Tetris has been documented a number of times in the past fairly well, I think. So if you've seen stuff like the Tetris from Russia with Love documentary, or more likely the Gaming Historian video, there's a fair chance you're probably not going to get a whole lot of new here, but there are a few fun stories told here regardless, and told from the people who were part of that story, along with some side material like photos and other things. The timeline stuff is very interesting if you're into that sort of thing, and definitely worth sampling for a little bit, or perhaps go through the whole thing and just learn a little more about the game that you're playing. Now, if you only care about the games, you don't care about the timeline, you don't care about the videos, you just want to play the games, well, you've got about 18-ish games to sample, and believe it or not, only a handful of these are actual Tetris titles, while the rest are derivatives of spin-off titles like Bombliss and Hatris, as well as a version of the strategy board game Go for the Famicom that honestly feels really out of place here, but it does have historical significance, and I suppose there's someone who is a fan of Go wanting a video game version of the thing, so have at it, I guess. Virtually all of these games were originally developed by Bulletproof Software, Hank Rogers' original software company that created a number of Tetris titles that were exclusive to the Japanese market, some of which we've actually sampled in past videos, and those titles are now part of this collection for a wider audience to enjoy. So you have the original Famicom Tetris game, the follow-up Tetris 2 plus Bombliss, not to be confused with the Tetris 2 game that we got, Super Famicom titles Super Tetris 2 plus Bombliss in both regular and limited editions. I honestly couldn't tell you the difference between the two, they both play the same to me. Super Tetris 3 and Tetris Battle Gaiden, which is sort of a head-to-head variant. There's also a couple flavors of Bombliss in the form of Super Bombliss for Super Famicom, Super Bombliss for Game Boy, which saw release around these parts under the name of Tetris Blast, Super Bombliss DX for Game Boy Color, which is just Super Bombliss with a bit of color splashed on and some new puzzles. Kind of pointless really, but it's in there. There's even Hatris releases for the Famicom, the Game Boy, and there's even an NES version, local NES version, that's similar to the Famicom version but has enough changes to warrant its own inclusion. Also part of the package are two Tetris games for MS-DOS, one from Academy Soft released in 1986, as well as the Spectrum Holobyte version released in 1988, the Apple II version from Spectrum Holobyte, and two sort of newish Tetris variants, which we'll touch on in a little bit. Virtually all of these games retain their original control scheme, which varies from game to game. They didn't try to make one universal setup or change anything drastically to be consistent with more familiar Tetris formats. So Famicom Tetris 1 retains its original press down to rotate and A to hard drop a piece into place control scheme, for example. And I do appreciate that. It's important that these games are preserved down to their essence so that people can sample these games as they were originally conceived without compromise. Well, almost. The computer versions used a keyboard, you're using a D-pad and some buttons, but you do get the general idea, I think. That said, you could rebind buttons if you want. You have one save state per game, as well as a rather limited kind of slow-ass rewind feature for the console releases. And there's even instruction manual scans and brief how-to-play blurbs to get you up to speed for each game. As alluded to, Tetris Forever also includes two bonus titles of sort. The first being a virtual recreation of the original Electronica 60 Tetris game conceived by Alexei Pajitnov. And well, what do you want me to say? It's a recreation of the very first Tetris game ever conceived. It is expectantly primitive. Only one rotate button, hard drops only, everything is rendered in text, you're only scored on how fast you drop your pieces and not on line clears, only one beeping sound, and you actually have to tap left or right each time you want to move your piece. For what it's worth, you've already played a variant of this when it was eventually ported over to MS-DOS in 1986, and it's pretty similar to that, but otherwise, it's a nice idea on paper to give players the chance to sample how Tetris first came into the world, and then promptly forget about it 5 minutes later to go back to NES Tetris or perhaps a more modern Tetris. And speaking of which, the other new bonus game is something called Tetris Time Warp, which serves as your modern-day Tetris guideline representation. Basically, this is a game where you play Tetris as you normally would in the modern age, complete with hold functions, ghost pieces, infinite spins, etc. But sometimes tetrominoes will appear in a different block style, and if any of these pieces are part of a line clear, you'll be warped back to an earlier version of Tetris, or more likely in my case, Bombless, where you're tasked with a challenge to complete in a short amount of time before you warp back to the main Tetris game that you were playing before. Again, a neat idea on paper, and I suppose for a multiplayer thing it might be a fun time, but at the end of the day, it's just modern Tetris with an extra gimmick added on, and after a while, I was just like, whatever, I didn't care. Probably would have cared more if the time warps went beyond Bombless 93 or 1989, which, by the way, if you prefer, the game also includes 2 marathon modes that excludes the whole time warping stuff. You could play the modern version without the time warping stuff, and there's also a 1989 version that attempts to replicate the look, feel, sounds, and gameplay of the original 1989 Tetris release on the original Game Boy, right down to LCD display filters, colors, and fake Game Boy border. It plays the part, it almost sounds the part save for some obvious sound effect and musical differences, and they tried their damnedest to make it look the part without being a direct copy, but it also has that very obvious "Mom, can we play Game Boy? We have Game Boy at home" feel that really makes me wish I were playing the actual thing instead, and I could because I do have Game Boy at home. A few, in fact. And also it's on NSO for the time being at least, so yes. And I think that's a bit of a weakness on Tetris Forever's part, and one that really couldn't be helped when you think about it. The documentary touches on all these other versions of Tetris that I kinda wish were included for the sake of completion. Granted, the Nintendo versions weren't going to make the cut for obvious reasons, but it would have been nice to have seen maybe the Tengen NES version or the Atari Arcade version. Maybe give Sega the 50 cents to license their version of Tetris in both arcade and the original Mega Drive release. Not the one that was made for the mini console in 2019, but the extremely rare one that very few people actually played outside of emulation. And of course, some people would like to have seen some late 90s output, like New Tetris, Next Tetris, Tetris Plus, and whatnot. Just to name a few examples, even though that's another layer of licensing stodge to get through, but stuff like that rather than recolored Bombless or just Hatris in general would have been nice to have, but I guess you could only go with what's available at the time or whatever you could actually get your hands on due to all these licensing deals and such. I don't know, it's hard to play a Tetris compilation that has a bunch of Tetris games on it and not walk away with the sense of why isn't so-and-so part of this package or whatever the case may be. I'd imagine it's going to be a case with anybody because there's just so many different Tetris games out there and almost everyone has played some variant of the game, so it's never going to hit all cylinders with any one person. There's always going to be some nagging omission here and there, and it depends, you know. But in my case, I'm happy with some of the inclusions because I've played some of these. I actually have some of these on hand. And they're probably my go-to Tetris games from time to time, and it's nice to see these get wider exposure, so that more people can play them and I guess appreciate them a little more. So I won't completely poo-poo this thing on the game selection. However, I do have quibbles regarding the Super Famicom emulation, particularly moments where it would feel a bit stuttery or laggy or slow down at times during transitions or just random times in general. Maybe that's something that gets fixed in a patch later down the road, but yeah, stuff like that should not be happening with SNES emulation in 2024, I'm just saying. As far as the rest of the games are concerned, well, Famicom and Game Boy emulation seems alright from what I can tell. Some people might notice some buzzing noises on some of the Famicom games, the first Tetris game specifically, but that's actually part of the game, it's not an emulation issue, so no real gripes there. DOS emulation is also fine, though it would have been nice to be able to use a keyboard instead of using this cumbersome interface to really nail that old school DOS vibe, but whatever, maybe that's something they could patch in as well. Maybe that's something you could do with this Steam version or something, I don't know, but yeah, that's Tetris Forever in a nutshell, pretty much. A pretty satisfying interactive timeline documentary feature lined up with some vintage Tetris titles and some other spin-off stuff. Again, there's always going to be that one omission or two that could have made things better depending on the person. I'm just happy to see these games in particular break out of their Japanese shell, as it were, and see exposure to a wider audience because they genuinely are great takes on the classic puzzle game, even if they are a bit on the old side. And of course there's a modern Tetris variant on there if you need that as well, though if you're playing this on Switch, you already have Tetris Effect and Tetris 99, which is, believe it or not, is still a thing in November of 2024. Long after Super Mario Bros. 35 and Pac-Man 99 or whatever it's called have long bitten the dust, Tetris 99 seems truly forever. That is until the Nintendo Knob or whatever the next console's called comes along and we move on to the next thing, but whatever. All in all, if you like Tetris and you want more Tetris, Tetris Forever will give you more Tetris. And so will I apparently, because there's one other Tetris game to pull out of the can for next time, and it's actually not on this collection, so yeah. Good night.